In this video, I'm going to cover how I use effects when I'm mixing music. Now, the main use case for these effects is to add space to the mix, or depth sometimes. And the main reason we need to do that is the way that we mic everything gives us a very dry signal that's very different from what we hear when we're in the room with the instrument. So we want to add back the room to the sound that we're collecting. And so the reason for that is if we were sitting in front of someone playing the guitar, when they play the guitar, you're not just hearing the sound directly from the guitar. You're actually hearing the sound direct from the guitar, but you're also hearing it bounce off of the walls and come back to you. And that's where you get the reverb sound. It's the sound of the room that the instrument or singer is in. Now, because we close mic or use DIs, it's a very dry signal, and so we use these digital effects in this case, or you can actually do this analog, which is where most of these sounds were originally came from. And we can add that space or that room sound back into the mix. All right, so let's just jump into it. We've got some tracks playing, and I'll go through a couple of instruments and vocals, and I'll go through how I use the effects. So first thing, how you use these. So if you go into your effects window on a digital console, you can generally choose what type of effect. If I hit my library button here, it gives me a list of effects, reverb, delay, modulators, gated verb, subharmonics, and then a bunch of different settings for each of those. If I open that up on here. So you can recall any of these to get whatever effect you want to use. So I have a Hall drum effect set up for my drums. Now, the way to think of this is because it's based off of how it was done in the analog realm, is to think of this as a separate unit that you need to send audio to and then bring back in. On this particular console, the first 4 effects have a dedicated return. So we use the send to send the audio to the effect. It does whatever it needs to do, and then the affected signal, or the wet signal, comes back in on the effect's return. So in analog, this effect would actually be a separate box. You'd have to run cables from the console into this box and then back in onto a separate channel. It's doing the exact same thing, just all internally. So on this one, I have my effect sends up here. My number 1 effect is my Hall drums that I use for my drums. So if I press this, it does a fader flip, and then as I turn stuff up, it'll be sent to the reverb unit. This is true for just the first 4 effects. We'll get into some other stuff after this, but we'll start with this. So I've got my snare drum. So I'll start it up. This is dry with no effects. So now if I hit my send and send this to the effects, so I'm taking the channel, it's sending a post fader to the effect unit and then coming back in. The post fader is important. It's how it's set up out of the box, but basically as I turn this up and down, the effect will turn down or up or down just as much. The send is after the fader, so any fader changes will affect how much of that is being sent. So as you turn it down, the effect will turn down as well, and that's what we want, because I don't want to pull the snare top right out, but you can still hear it coming as a reverb. Now, I'll do it again, but get into some of the settings and what they do. So, if we go back into here and we bring our snare back in and add the effect in. So, the first one is pre-delay. This is Pre-delay is how much time after the initial send till the effect happens. So at a low time or quick, then the effect is happening instantaneously. But if I crank this up, you can now hear that there's a space between them. So use the pre-delay to sort of dial certain things in. So for drums, generally you want it pretty close. So we'll stick with what it had, which was 10 milliseconds. The next one is decay time. So decay is how long does it take for this effect to fade away or decay away. So we bring this back in. So this is a very fast decay time, so it's just 240 milliseconds. So if I bring this back up, you'll hear that it just hits and goes away. But if we crank this up to almost 5 seconds, you can actually hear that it takes a while for this to actually dissipate. It just hangs there, and then in this case, because the drum, it's actually getting in the way of the next drum hit. So it's making it very messy. And this is part of the problem you can run into with effects. You generally don't want it to get in the way of the actual sound because it can muddy up the whole mix. So in this case, I did kind of like the 1 second decay time. Now, the other two settings that are kind of important here would be the low frequency cut and the high frequency cut. This is just removing, this is an EQ before it goes through the effect. So I don't really want the low frequencies to be affected by this reverb, so I'm cutting out everything below 200 hertz. And then I don't want the really high stuff in there, so I'm cutting out everything above 4.5 kilohertz. And we can adjust how much is sent to get less of that effect, or we can actually turn down the drum return. This is the effects return for this effect, and this is actually just a volume control for what's coming back to me. So that's the main settings for the reverb. That one's the drum reverb. If I move on, I have one for my band. It's a hall reverb. I'd use this for something like the acoustic guitar. So if I bring in my acoustic, so I've got my acoustic playing, it's dry, and then I can add in and then when I mute it, you can hear that decay time, decay out. So same thing for the vocal reverb. For the vocals, I generally use, in this case, it's called an EMT 250, which is an emulation of a plate reverb, and it just sort of gives you more of a high frequency sort of sound. So I think it sounds pretty good on vocals. So if we bring one in.
He is mighty to save forever, author of salvation.
And I can adjust decay time, make it shorter. I can go longer. This is where pre-delay is nice. If you add a bit of pre-delay, it'll sort of separate. It'll separate the effect from the vocal a little bit, and so it helps with clarity. The vocal comes through, and then you hear the effect, as opposed to blending together, sort of pushing the vocal into the background. The other effect that I would use on a send return is a delay. And this is where you get the sort of echo effect. So I bring that vocal back in and add the delay.
He can move the mountains. My God is mighty to save.
You get that echo effect. This one can actually has an extra button. It's this blinking one here. It's a tap tempo. You can tap it in time to the song, and that'll make those echoes happen in time.
Shine your light and let the whole world see.
And then some of the controls on here, you got input filters like on the Reverb. This just cuts out certain frequencies so that it's completely out of the effect. Mainly for vocals, I'll take all the high end out so that it doesn't cut through as much and sort of fits in more. I've been exaggerating how much I've been using it. And you've got our tap tempo, and then the feedback is how many echoes do you want, because that's how much is it feeding back into itself. So if I make this really low, it's basically one sort of echo. But if I make this really long, you can hear that it takes much longer for this to sort of fade out because you're sending more of it back into itself. So that's the basics for the effects. Mainly, like, this is a lot of effects that I'm using right now. Generally, the goal I say for effects is you don't want to hear them, but you want to miss them when they're gone. So if I So I have the effects going here, but I've dialed them back quite a bit. But if I mute it, it's very noticeable that they're gone. And then when I bring it back in, you can still hear them, but you're not so much hearing them as feeling them would be sort of the goal. You wouldn't hear them as much when you bring it in with a whole mix. But the idea is just sort of add just enough of the effect that if you muted it, you miss it, but you can't really describe why you miss it, if that's a good way of describing that. The last thing I'll get into here is some of the effects. If you want to use more than the 4 here, you have to sacrifice one of your mixes on the side here. You can actually turn it into a send, and then you would use, it has 4 more effects returns that'll turn on when you do that. But the other option is as an insert. So if I wanted to use this de-esser, I'll load in de-esser, and then on the back panel, we can switch to insert, and then we can insert it on our vocal. So input, in this case 27. Now if we look at the front panel, we can see that it's kicking in now. So you can only do an insert on one channel, as opposed to with a mixed return setup, you can send multiple channels and then bring that as a single return. This is just placed in the actual channel. So if I go to that vocal, go to insert, you can see that there's now an insert turned on, and it's sending to effects unit 5 and then coming back. You have the 4 mix return effects, which is the common way of using for time-based effects like reverb and delay. You can also use it for like chorus. And then you have insert effects, which in this case is more useful for a de-esser or a multi-band compressor or dynamic EQ. something like that, where you just put it, but it only work on one channel. And that's about it. So if you found that helpful, you can check out some of the other videos on my channel, which covers stuff like this. And hope you have a good day. Thanks.